Travelers of lonely roads, explorers of the great outdoors, workers in creepy jobs and late-night shifts, what's your scary story? I was the navigation officer for a research ship in the South Pacific. We had recently come to Papua New Guinea for work along the coast. We arrived in a small bay at around 10 p.m. in the dark and dropped the anchor. I went over to mark our position on the chart and noticed an annotation that said, "Native village reported in the area." There were no fires or lights on the coast, so I did not think anything more of it. I turned on all the deck and underwater lights and went back to the bridge to stand my night watch as everyone else went to bed. With all the lights on, I could not see farther than about 25 yards because of a light mist in the pitch-black night. I sat on the bridge with the door open because I liked the sound of the night and the feeling of the air in the tropics. I kept hearing lights splashing in the water and went out to look, because we often get hundreds of fish in our underwater lights. There was nothing there. I went back inside but kept hearing faint splashing and could not figure out where it was coming from. Since I could not see into the distance, I went into the chart room, switched on our infrared camera system, and there they all were. About 50 native outrigger canoes just sitting outside our pool of light, about 3 people to a canoe, all just sitting and watching us, occasionally paddling one way or the other to keep their station. I have never felt so suddenly and violently alone and small as I did on that ship in the dark. I got a deckhand up, and we both walked around the decks to show that people were awake and moving. They sat there and watched us all night, completely invisible except on the infrared cameras. In the morning they came in and traded with us and were very friendly. They just had not had a ship in their bay for decades. I was driving down an old highway, not heavily used anymore, during a snowstorm in 2011 and had a pretty close call on that trip. I was heading to the next town with my girlfriend at the time, and we were behind a sport utility vehicle on the road. We followed them for a good while until they came to a stop, and I pulled around to see why. A truck sat in the road, its driver and passenger doors open, with 2 sets of tracks in the snow leading into the woods. I got out to make sure no one was hurt or needed help, but there were no signs of car trouble. There wasn't much snow inside the cab, so the doors hadn't been open for long. It was snowing hard. I started to follow the tracks into the trees but hesitated. Before I did anything else, the driver of the sport utility vehicle called me over and said the truck had been reported stolen. They told me highway patrol was on the way, so I left it at that. A day or so later I learned the truck's owner was a local man who'd been missing for over a week. Police searched the woods and found his freshly deceased body in a ditch with a single gunshot wound. Whoever took him must have marched him out there, killed him, and disappeared into the forest. I'm still glad I didn't follow those tracks. I didn't hear a shot, so it must have happened right before we got there. I don't want to think about what might have happened if I'd kept going. Once I was working in a restaurant and finished at around 12 a.m. I always rode my bicycle to and from work. It was about a 15-minute ride along a bike trail next to the train tracks. The trail was mostly straight but had exits here and there. Only a few small sections were lit by streetlights, so without my front bicycle light I would be totally blind for the most part. One night I left on my way home after the shift and noticed a guy biking behind me, which is not too weird at that time of night in a busy, but very safe, city. It was strange that he had no lights and was still there after the first main exits, which led to a small town, but I figured it might just be a coincidence. I felt a bit creeped out and thought I might just be tired and that the dark of the night was getting to me. I decided to bike a bit slower so he could pass. There was definitely enough room on the trail. He instead drifted along at the same speed as me and made no attempt to pass or even come closer. When I was a few minutes away from home, I decided to take random lefts and rights instead of going straight home, just in case this person was following me and I did not want him to find out where I live. I rode through random twists and turns in a suburban neighborhood, and he's still behind me. As I realized I was heading toward a long, narrow, dark path meant only for bicycles, I turned into one of the houses and hid in the shadows near the garage. I heard him pass the house and brake hard on that small path. My blood was boiling. I hopped back on my bike, and when I reached the end of the street I stopped and stared at him. At least I hope he thought I did, because I could not see anything of his face. I biked away as fast as I could, then did a few extra loops here and there until I felt safe and alone again before heading home. Nothing like that has happened to me since, and I still do not know who it was or why. I am happy not knowing. I worked at a movie theater and most often worked the closing shift. One night another manager and I were sitting in the small office. She was working on the nightly deposit and I was finishing up inventory numbers. We had a CD player we listened to at night with a stack of discs next to it. I stood up, swapped in a new disc, and sat back down. About a minute later the entire pile suddenly launched itself across the room. One of the discs hit my coworker on the back of the head. She looked around and saw me sitting there, dumbfounded, with jewel cases and discs scattered all around the office. We quickly finished up and left. A couple of days later one of the other day shift managers called me and asked what we had been doing that night. She sounded annoyed, which was out of character because we were friends. I asked what she meant, and she asked why we had dumped all the security tapes onto the floor and left them there. I told her we hadn't touched the security tapes at all. The tapes were stored on top of the CCTV monitor on a small VHS shelf. The shelf hadn't been moved, and only the tapes were on the floor. She also said that all of the sleeves had been removed and thrown everywhere too. A couple of years ago, I was living in Colombo, Sri Lanka, at a small hostel on the outskirts of the city. The hostel catered to long-term guests, so I got to know everyone pretty well. There was a guy living with us named Raj, and he was a middleman of sorts in the casinos. In Sri Lanka, the casinos are incredibly shady places full of Russian mobsters and other low-life criminals from China and India. The casinos are technically illegal, but they continue operating through bribery and government coercion. I went to one of them once, and it was a surreal experience. Anyway, Raj's job was to take online bets from Indian clients and place them physically in the casino. He was playing with their money and was simply the vessel that allowed people to play from another location. He played in some high-stakes games with a lot of money for powerful people, basically a recipe for disaster. One night he messed up, big time. One of his clients managed to gain access to his online system and stole all the money his clients had deposited to play, a sum well over $50,000, which is a fortune in Sri Lanka. We only found out about the theft after Raj's disappearance. A note was left on his bed, very cryptic, saying, "Don't look for me," and "I'm leaving," among other things. Dude vanished overnight. We filed a police report and waited to hear anything. After a few days the police came back to the hostel, asking someone who knew Raj to join them. The locals were afraid to go, so I volunteered and was taken to their headquarters. They took me to the back where I was shown photos of a body in very bad condition. It was Raj. He had been dumped in the nearby sewer canal. They brought me there to identify him. They never found who did it, and the image of those photos has never really left me. I left the hostel shortly afterward. Poor guy was caught up in some shady stuff, but he did not deserve that. Not exactly a lonely road, but I was speeding west on I-70 through Colorado near Glenwood Canyon when I decided to slow down and enjoy the view. A minute later I noticed a state patrol car ahead of me turn on its siren, and I figured I was busted for speeding. Instead, the trooper pulled onto the shoulder to help a broken-down motorist. I slowed down and saw the motorist sitting in the driver's seat with his head down, thinking, man, that guy is lucky to get help out here, no cell coverage and so on. I kept driving west. A few minutes later police cars started flying past me, racing east with their sirens blaring and tearing through the curvy canyon. For about 15 minutes ambulances and fire trucks followed in quick succession. It seemed like every emergency vehicle in the county was heading back the way I'd come. The next day I was at a hotel in Utah when I found out what happened. The broken-down motorist had skipped bail, and when the state trooper stopped to help, he got out of his car and shot the officer in the back multiple times. On a normal day the officer would have died because they usually drive alone, but that day he was on the way to training and had a partner in the car who emptied his magazine and killed the motorist. The officer almost didn't survive on the road but pulled through. I used to have a buddy who lived in the same neighborhood, a few streets over. One night we were having a couple of beers in his backyard while playing cards. I had some things to do the next morning, so just before 10 I said my goodbyes and headed home. It was a short walk, maybe 15 minutes door to door, so I never drove. It was a nice night, an uneventful trip. But when I got home, my roommate was coming out the front door, coffee in hand and dressed for work. He gave me a funny look and said he thought I was asleep since my truck was in the driveway. I told him where I'd been and asked why he was going to work at night. He laughed and asked if I was drunk. We stared at each other for a minute, and then he told me it was just after 5 a.m. and he was leaving like he usually did. In my entire life, I'd never felt more confused. I could tell he was dead serious, but I knew I had just left my friend's house. I checked my phone, and sure enough, it was a little after 5 a.m. My roommate left for work. I paced around the living room for a bit, then called the friend whose house I'd just left. He answered groggily and confirmed I'd left at 10 the previous evening. I have no idea what happened during those 7 hours of my life, and it still gives me chills to think about it. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't tired, no one could have slipped anything into either of the 2 Coors Lights I'd had, I have no medical conditions that would cause a blackout, and nothing like it has happened since. I just don't know what happened to that time. When I was 18, my family and I took a vacation to Hawaii. My mother wanted to do the touristy thing and drive the road to Hana. Normally you can take a tour bus up there, but that wasn't good enough for her, so we rented a car. The rental companies typically forbid driving that road because of liability issues, but that didn't stop my mother. The drive up was normal, with plenty to see, and we spent all day exploring. By the time everyone was exhausted it was night. We were a good distance from the main road down, somewhere on the back dirt roads of Maui, so what did we do? We followed some of the closed local roads. One in particular was a very narrow, winding lane along the edge of the island. You couldn't even stop to get out and pee. If you looked over the side, it was a straight drop into the ocean. We were creeping along in the dark when we came to a strange bend backed by dense forest, a small waterfall, and a cliff overhang just above us. My mother wanted pictures of the moon, the stars, and the ocean because the view was breathtaking without city lights, so we pulled to the side, just enough space to let another car pass. I got out too. It was absolutely silent. Then, out of nowhere, I heard what sounded like a crying baby, which was weird. We were in the middle of nowhere and hadn't seen anyone for hours. I stood there, confused, and then it stopped. I motioned for my mother to come over and asked if she'd heard anything. She hadn't. We waited a little longer and the crying started again. Neither of us could tell where it was coming from. We both panicked a bit, because that's what a crying baby does to most humans. We spent a good hour calling out and trying to decide what to do, and eventually it stopped. We drove back to the hotel and never heard anything else about it. Once my friend and I were on an overnight hike to the summit of a peak. To get from the campgrounds to the summit you had to walk across one set of mountain ridges, descend into a valley, then climb onto another set of ridges, unless you wanted to wade a deep river. You can't reach the mountain in one day, so we had to find a place to camp. In this part of Alaska everything is tundra and mountains except for the valley between the ridges. The valley offers cover from the wind, so we set up camp there. The campground has the only road to civilization for miles. Coming from any other direction means the nearest town is more than 160 kilometers away. When we arrived we were the only people at the campground. Late that night we were trying to fall asleep when we heard footsteps approaching, slow human steps accompanied by raspy breathing. It was definitely a person, not an animal. We had a bolt-action rifle for bear protection, so I called out, asking who was there, but got no answer. Then we heard something knock over our clothes-drying rack. I was scared shitless and warned the person outside that we were armed. The footsteps suddenly sped up as whoever it was ran past our tent, heading away from the campground. I noticed no pack rattling, which felt strange. We barely slept. When the sun reached the valley we crawled out to find the rack in tatters and small boot prints leading toward and away from the tent. We still reached the mountain but hustled back to the campground as fast as we could. I don't know who that was, but I didn't go camping for a while after that. Back in the early 1990s I worked for Domino's Pizza. At the time I was an assistant manager, but we still had to deliver sometimes. Just after 11 p.m. one night I took an order to a house in one of our middle-income neighborhoods. When I got there not a single light was on. If the porch light wasn't lit we were supposed to drive to a payphone and call the number on the order to prevent robberies. I usually ignored that rule and went straight to the door, but my gut told me to hold off. I sat in my car for a minute, then drove 2 blocks to a payphone and called the number. It was disconnected. I waited a bit, then made the second required call, still disconnected. While I was there I noticed a Pizza Hut driver passing by but did not think much of it. For some reason I decided to go back to the house and see whether anyone would come to the door. When I returned the Pizza Hut car was in the driveway, and I thought, what the hell? I turned into the long drive lined on one side by tall evergreens. Right away I saw something large on the ground next to the open driver's door of the Pizza Hut car. I pulled in behind him, parked, and realized it was the driver. Thinking he might have had a heart attack, I ran up to help, then saw his head was badly injured. I sprinted back to my car, locked the doors, and raced the 2 blocks to the payphone at around 145 kilometers per hour to call the police. Then I phoned my store so they could alert Pizza Hut. I waited for the cops to pass me and followed them back. Eventually a detective spoke with me. He said they had found a real estate sign in the bushes beside the driveway, the power to the house was shut off, and the place was completely empty. 2 sets of footprints were in those same bushes. It looked like someone ordered from both pizza places and waited to rob whoever arrived first. I had been the first driver, but because I never stepped out of my car they had to wait for Pizza Hut. If I had gone to the door that first time, I would have been the one on the ground. After that night I never knocked on a door without a porch light unless I knew the customer really well. I was camping in my car while driving up to see my family in Salt Lake. I was taking my time on what should have been about an 11-hour drive with minimal stops. Since I was on my own, I kept pulling over to take in the views. I think I was about 18, and with not much money to my name I decided to skip a pricey room and find a secluded spot off the freeway in the desert. For anyone who has driven the route, it was about an hour past the racetrack just outside of Las Vegas. It was one of those exits with only farm roads branching off, so I figured I would not be on anyone's land who would mind, or ever even check on me. I parked, sat on my tailgate, and enjoyed a dinner of beef jerky and Arizona tea while listening to music. Out of nowhere a motorcycle flew past, no lights, nothing. It was going fast enough that it took me a solid 20 seconds to process what I had just seen. I laughed and shook my head, figuring it was that rider's life, their choice. Not a minute later 2 low-flying jets roared overhead, Top Gun style, carving around mountains and along the valleys. It was quite a show. About 10 minutes after that, I heard a convoy rolling down the road before I saw the lights. I grew up in the military, so I am used to seeing convoys, but this felt different, maybe because of everything that had just happened. Normally you wave and let them pass, but it was nearly midnight, and something told me to turn around and act like I had not seen anything. A Humvee pulled up and basically blocked me from moving my car. I heard doors open, but no one approached. I was leaning on my hood with the engine off, so I kept my hands visible on the metal and did not even turn to look. I could feel them staring. The convoy passed, the Humvee pulled out, and they all continued on their way. Looking back, it was probably coincidence. The jets were likely training out of the Air Force base next to Las Vegas, the motorcyclist was just enjoying empty roads, and the convoy was on a night exercise. Still, the sequence of events made the desert feel a lot less empty. I don't really know if it qualifies as scary, but I remember getting hit from behind by something while I was stopped in the middle of an intersection late at night last year. To this day I don't know what it was. I even watched the traffic camera footage and saw nothing. All it showed was me completely stopped in the middle of the road, waiting for a car in front of me to pass so I could cross, when my car shook like something had hit it from behind. About a minute later it showed me pulling to the side to check what had happened. The hit didn't leave any dents or scratches, but the impact was strong enough to misalign my bumper. I've tried to avoid that road ever since. I had just turned 18 and was working a closing shift at a small cafe inside a grocery store. One of my regular customers, Tom, was a hugger. He would walk in and call out, "Where's my girls?" And we would all have to awkwardly hug this 80-year-old man while he whispered, "God bless you," in our ears. I hated Tom. He always held on a little too long and whispered way too close. On this shift I was closing alone and Tom came in around 4 p.m. Not unusual. I dealt with the creepiness and got him his coffee and bagel. He was with his wife this time. She was sweet but looked exhausted. As I worked he started asking questions. What do I have to do at night? Is it hard closing alone? What time am I off? Do I ever get scared walking to my car in the dark? The questions grew progressively more uncomfortable, and his wife just sat there silently. I answered as politely as I could, despite the hair standing up on the back of my neck. I caught him staring at me often, but I was off at 7 p.m., so I thought it would be fine. He did not leave. His wife went home without him and he just stayed, staring, for hours. I asked if he needed anything else. He said no, that he was waiting for me to get off work because young girls should not be alone in a dark parking lot. I told him it was not necessary and kept working, ignoring him even as he stared. He finally left about 15 minutes before my shift ended, vanishing into the dark Michigan winter, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I punched out and headed to my car. I grabbed my snow brush and started clearing the windshield, enjoying the quiet unique to a snowy night. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I brushed it off. This was a parking lot, but they came closer, past every other car and straight toward mine in the employee section. I turned. It was Tom, about 15 meters away and smiling. He said I should have looked for him. He had been sitting outside waiting because it was dangerous for young girls to be alone at night. I started shaking. I tried to open my door, but it was frozen shut from an earlier storm. Tom came closer, calling me a stupid girl and asking God to forgive him. I thought about running back inside, but he might catch me. I fumbled in my purse for my pepper spray, thankfully attached to my keys. I told him to stay back, that I had pepper spray, and to go home to his wife. He glowered at me. I held up the teal canister. We were roughly 4.5 meters apart, well within range. He called me a bitch and went back into the store. I got into my half-cleared car and drove home, terrified. I called the store when I got home, about 2.5 kilometers away, and told them what had happened. They kicked Tom out and told him not to return. He started cursing, and his wife had to pick him up. A couple of years later he was arrested for having illegal material on his computer, but by then I had moved away. I was not sorry to hear it. This happened on a Danish highway with plenty of traffic. I was riding my motorcycle and pulled over at a rest stop that had only a parking lot and a toilet, no gas station, and was hidden from the highway by trees. When I stopped, there was just one car in the lot. A man standing next to it came over and seemed a little odd. He told me he was a German chemistry professor, but he did not look the part. He had been sleeping in the trunk of his station wagon and, when he climbed out through the rear hatch, he left the keys inside and locked himself out. He asked to borrow my phone to call for assistance, and I let him. After the call he kept chatting about his trip while I tried to wrap things up. Then a rundown van covered in graffiti pulled up. Out stepped a guy who looked a bit off, like a mix of 1980s denim jacket gang member and small-time dealer. He opened with, "How much is that motorcycle worth?" which felt threatening. He went on about how nice my bike was and launched into his life story. He'd been a West German truck driver in the 1980s, hauling routes into East Germany, where he had an East German girlfriend. They were discovered by the Stasi, and he never saw her again. He believed they killed her because she was involved with a West German. Later he moved to Norway and worked 10 years as a butcher. Then some things happened, and I joined the Foreign Legion. The way he said it made me think he'd committed a serious crime and ducked the authorities by enlisting, which can happen. By then I was convinced he was making things up, though I couldn't tell what he wanted. Did he plan to steal my bike, my wallet, my phone? Meanwhile, the professor badly wanted to leave but was still locked out of his car. The odd guy and I were speaking partly Danish and Norwegian, so the professor didn't follow the conversation but sensed enough to be nervous. I decided to tug on the stranger's story and asked about something I'd heard. That legionnaires get a dog, must care for it, and then are ordered to kill and eat it. Nope, he said. It's a rabbit, not a dog. He described it in detail, sounding very convincing. Then he pulled up his sleeve and revealed a tattoo of a French Foreign Legion soldier in uniform, covering his arm from elbow to wrist. Non-legionnaires don't get tattoos like that. I was still figuring out his angle when a roadside assistance truck arrived for the professor. Realizing what was happening, the stranger grew annoyed because, if he had known, he could have picked the lock in seconds. He said he had the tools in his van. While he and the professor focused on the car, I got on my bike and took off. In the end I think he really was a legionnaire, butcher, and truck driver, just a lonely guy looking for conversation but no longer used to friendly civilian talk. He probably had hundreds of stories worth hearing, but I'd prefer to hear them somewhere less isolated than a Danish rest stop. Graveyard shift worker at the time. I won't go into details, but I stopped a guy from holding me at gunpoint and taking my vehicle while I was pumping gas. The station was closed, it was 2 a.m. The streets were pitch black. A guy came walking up out of nowhere and asked where I was headed, what time it was, and so on, just trying to get me to talk. Nothing alarming at first, except he was fidgety and had one hand in the front pocket of his leather jacket the whole time. I thought, fuck it, I was almost done pumping. I decided that if this was it, I would make the best of it. Maybe he needed whatever it was more than I did, so I said, need a ride somewhere? I was on my way home from work, but I have a few dollars. We can stop for food because I'm hungry and I don't mind some company. What's your name? Mine is Mary. I know that if you get personal with an attacker it gets harder for them to hurt you. I was thinking, take me hostage, hold me at gunpoint, yell in my face, I can handle that, but please do not take my life and do not leave me 2 hours from home in the middle of the night. I finished pumping, giving him only a short time to think about his answer, and in his panic when I offered him the things he was about to take, he said, nah, I'm just going to walk, thanks again, and left. I carry a taser now. So this happened on my shift, graveyard, when I was helping another short-staffed store across town. A woman came in looking a little frazzled and carrying a Bible, but otherwise she seemed fine. She bought some chips and started talking about how crazy this coronavirus stuff is, yada yada. Then she told me she ate an evil spirit pretending to be a clove of garlic. I figured she was messing with me, but she pulled out a piece of garlic, laid it on the counter, and said it was actually a demon that wanted to possess her. She asked if I believe in spirits or if I can see it, because although I look human and 1/3 demon, I'm really human and 1/3 angel who was sent to help her expel the evil urges she feels. She said it was okay if I didn't know this because she could see it, and she left the garlic on the counter, telling me she'd wait for me to deal with it. That's where the original incident ended. A few days later, around 2 a.m., maybe 2:15, on a Tuesday, I was working the graveyard shift at my usual store when the same woman showed up again. She bought some candy, hung around asking about jade jewelry and incense, and wondered if we'd met before. Nothing as weird as before. The strange part is I never heard the door chime. We have a loud siren that goes off when the doors open and stops only when they close. I'd been stocking and cleaning up front the whole time and had seen only 2 or 3 customers before her, so it was weird that I didn't hear it. She lingered for a bit, then rushed to the restroom and didn't come out until about 6 a.m. She said, "Have a nice day," and walked out like nothing happened. That freaked me out, because I cleaned the restrooms a little after she went in, and she must have slipped out or hidden somewhere when I was cleaning. Outside of hiding in a stall, there's nowhere to hide in there, and there are no windows. I even checked the tops of the stalls and the ceiling, thinking she pulled a Spider-Man, but nope, she just disappeared and then casually reappeared a couple of hours later.